On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop Tiananmen Gate in Beijing and declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China, transforming the world's oldest continuous civilization into the largest communist state in human history. This was not a coup executed in the shadows, but a revolution that had been building for more than a century, fed by humiliation, starvation, and the collapse of an empire that had endured for millennia. How did a nation that invented gunpowder, the compass, and bureaucratic excellence fall so completely into chaos that communism seemed like the only answer? To understand the speed and totality of China's communist transformation, you have to go back to the moment when the old order first cracked beyond repair. In 1839, the Qing Dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, found itself confronting British gunboats over opium, a drug the British were smuggling into China by the ton to balance their trade deficit caused by Chinese tea and silk exports. The Qing government tried to stop it. Commissioner Lin Zexu seized and destroyed over 1,000 tons of opium in Guangzhou, expecting the British to back down. They did not. What followed was the First Opium War, and China lost catastrophically. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced China to cede Hong Kong, open 5 ports to foreign trade, and pay massive indemnities. This was not just a military defeat, but a psychological earthquake that shattered the idea of China as the celestial empire, the center of the world. The humiliation did not stop there. Over the next 70 years, foreign powers carved China into spheres of influence like vultures over a dying animal. France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and the United States all extracted concessions, ports, and railroads. The Qing court, meanwhile, was paralyzed by internal corruption and ideological rigidity. The emperor was often a child. Real power lay with conservative officials, and most famously, the Empress Dowager Cixi, who diverted funds meant for the navy to rebuild the summer palace. The state was rotting from within, while foreign powers tightened their grip from without. Then came the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Between 1850 and 1864, a failed civil service exam candidate named Hong Xiuquan, who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, led a millenarian uprising that nearly toppled the Qing Dynasty. His heavenly kingdom of great peace controlled vast swaths of southern China, established a capital in Nanjing, and promoted radical policies including land redistribution, gender equality, and the abolition of private property. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but not before claiming between 20 and 30 million lives. The Qing survived, but the scars were deep. The dynasty had proven it could not protect its people or defend its borders. If you're starting to see a pattern here, chaos feeding into more chaos, decisions made too late or not at all, then you're beginning to understand why millions of Chinese would eventually look to an ideology that promised total reinvention. But before we get to communism, we need to talk about the moment when China tried to reform itself and failed. Subscribe now if you're here to uncover the real turning points in Chinese history, the decisions and disasters that textbooks gloss over, but that changed everything. In 1898, a young and idealistic emperor named Guangxu, inspired by Japan's rapid modernization during the Meiji Restoration, launched the 100 Days Reform. He issued more than 40 edicts in just over 3 months, aiming to overhaul the education system, modernize the military, streamline the bureaucracy, and encourage industrial development. It was an attempt to save China through top-down transformation. But the conservative elite, led by Empress Dowager Cixi, saw it as a threat to their power. She staged a coup, placed the emperor under house arrest, and reversed almost all the reforms. 6 reformers were executed. The message was clear: the Qing dynasty would rather die than change. And die it did, but slowly, agonizingly. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion erupted, a violent anti-foreign movement supported covertly by Cixi herself. The Boxers, members of a secret society who believed they were invulnerable to bullets, besieged foreign legations in Beijing. 8 foreign powers formed an alliance, invaded Beijing, and crushed the rebellion. The Qing government was forced to sign the Boxer Protocol in 1901, which imposed another crushing indemnity and allowed foreign troops to be stationed in the capital. China was no longer even sovereign in its own capital city. By the early 20th century, the Qing dynasty was a shell. Revolutionary movements, many led by Chinese students studying abroad in Japan and the West, began to proliferate. The most important figure among them was Sun Yat-sen, a Western-educated physician who founded the Tongmenghui, a revolutionary alliance, in 1905. Sun's ideology, known as the 3 Principles of the People, called for nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. He wanted to overthrow the Qing, establish a republic, and modernize China. But Sun was not a military man, and revolutions require more than ideas. The revolution came almost by accident. On October 10, 1911, an accidental explosion in Wuchang triggered an uprising by revolutionary troops. Within weeks, province after province declared independence from the Qing. The dynasty, unable to muster the will or the resources to resist, collapsed. In February 1912, the last emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Puyi, abdicated. China became a republic, the first in Asia. Sun Yat-sen became provisional president, but he lacked military power and ceded the presidency to Yuan Shikai, a former Qing general who commanded the only effective army in China. Yuan promised to uphold the republic. He did not. Yuan Shikai quickly revealed himself to be a dictator in the making. He dissolved parliament, outlawed Sun's newly formed political party, the Kuomintang, and in 1915, he declared himself emperor. The backlash was immediate. Provinces rebelled, and Yuan's imperial dream collapsed within months. He died in 1916, humiliated and isolated. What followed was the warlord era, a period of brutal fragmentation during which regional military strongmen carved China into personal fiefdoms. There was no central government, no rule of law, just violence, taxation by force, and the constant threat of starvation. China, in other words, was in free fall. It was in this context of utter disintegration that Chinese intellectuals began to search desperately for new ideas. The May 4th movement of 1919 was a turning point. It began as a protest against the Treaty of Versailles, which, despite China having fought on the Allied side during World War I, handed former German concessions in Shandong province to Japan instead of returning them to China. On May 4th, thousands of students gathered in Beijing, denouncing the warlord government and calling for a cultural and intellectual revolution. The movement quickly evolved into a broader critique of Confucianism, traditionalism, and China's weakness. Young Chinese intellectuals devoured Western ideas, liberalism, anarchism, and yes, Marxism. Marxism arrived in China at exactly the right moment. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had shown that a poor, agrarian country could overthrow an old regime and build something entirely new. Lenin's writings on imperialism resonated deeply with Chinese intellectuals who saw their country carved up by foreign powers. In 1921, in a small house in Shanghai, 13 delegates, including a young library assistant named Mao Zedong, gathered to found the Chinese Communist Party. The party was tiny, with fewer than 60 members. The Soviet Union, through the Communist International, provided money, advisors, and strategic guidance. The CCP's early mission was to organize workers in China's new industrial cities. But China was still overwhelmingly rural. The real question was how to build a communist revolution in a country with barely any proletariat. Meanwhile, Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang were struggling to reunify China. Sun, desperate for support, accepted Soviet aid and agreed to a united front with the Communists in 1923. Soviet advisors helped reorganize the Kuomintang along Leninist lines, creating a disciplined, centralized party. The CCP members were instructed to join the Kuomintang as individuals while maintaining their own separate organization. It was a marriage of convenience, and it would not last. Sun Yat-sen died of cancer in 1925, before the dream of reunification could be realized. Leadership of the Kuomintang eventually passed to a young military officer named Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was ambitious, ruthless, and deeply anti-communist. In 1926, he launched the Northern Expedition, a military campaign to defeat the warlords and reunify China under Kuomintang rule. The campaign was remarkably successful. Warlords were defeated or co-opted, and by 1927, Chiang's forces had taken Shanghai and Nanjing. But as the Kuomintang's power grew, Chiang became convinced that the communists were a threat. On April 12, 1927, in what became known as the Shanghai Massacre, Chiang ordered his troops and allied gangsters to round up and execute Communist Party members and labor organizers. Thousands were killed. The First United Front was over. The communists who survived went underground or fled to the countryside. This moment of betrayal was a turning point for the Chinese Communist Party. The strategy of urban insurrection had failed. The party was decimated in the cities. Mao Zedong, who had been conducting rural organizing in Hunan province, began to argue for a new strategy, base the revolution not in the cities, but in the countryside among the peasants. This was heretical from a Marxist perspective. Marx had said the proletariat would lead the revolution. Mao said the peasants could. He retreated to the mountains of Jiangxi province and began building a rural Soviet, a communist base area with its own government, army, and land reform policies. The Red Army, as the communist forces were called, grew by recruiting landless peasants with promises of land redistribution. Chiang Kai-shek, meanwhile, established his capital in Nanjing and declared the success of the northern expedition. But China was not truly unified. Warlords still controlled large areas, and the communists were building power in the countryside. Chiang launched a series of encirclement campaigns to destroy the communist base areas. By 1934, after multiple failed attempts, Chiang's fifth encirclement campaign, advised by German military experts, was succeeding. The communists were surrounded, outnumbered, and on the brink of annihilation. Faced with destruction, the Red Army broke through Kuomintang lines in October 1934 and began what would become known as the Long March. The Long March was not a single journey, but a year-long fighting retreat across some of the most inhospitable terrain in China. The Red Army, along with Communist Party officials and supporters, numbering perhaps 80 to 90,000 at the start, marched over 6,000 miles, crossing 18 mountain ranges and 24 rivers, constantly harassed by Kuomintang forces and local warlords. They crossed the Luding Bridge, a chain bridge over a raging river, under heavy fire. They traversed snowy mountain passes where altitude sickness and cold killed hundreds. They marched through swamps where men disappeared into the mud. Of the original number who set out, only about 8,000 reached the communist base in Yan'an, in Shaanxi province, in October 1935. The Long March was a catastrophe in terms of lives lost, but it became the founding myth of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao Zedong emerged from it as the undisputed leader of the party. During a key meeting at Zunyi in January 1935, mid-March, Mao gained control of the party's military strategy. The march itself became a propaganda victory, a story of perseverance, sacrifice, and revolutionary heroism. In Yan'an, the communists rebuilt. They established a disciplined base area, implemented land reform, and trained cadres. Mao developed his theories of guerrilla warfare and peasant revolution. The party was no longer a marginal urban movement. It was a rural insurgency with a proven capacity to survive. Then came the Japanese. In 1931, Japan had invaded and occupied Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing in July 1937 marked the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, though it was really a continuation of Japanese aggression. Chiang Kai-shek faced a dilemma: fight the communists or fight the Japanese. He wanted to eliminate the communists first. But public opinion and even some of his own generals disagreed. In December 1936, Chiang was kidnapped by one of his own commanders, Zhang Xueliang, in the Xi'an incident and forced to agree to a second united front with the communists against Japan. The Second Sino-Japanese War was brutal beyond measure. Japanese forces committed atrocities on a massive scale. The rape of Nanking in December 1937 saw the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Japanese troops engaged in widespread rape, looting, and murder. The Kuomintang government retreated inland to Chongqing, and China's coastal cities and industrial centers fell under Japanese occupation. The war would drag on for 8 years, devastating the country and killing millions. During the war, the communists and the Kuomintang were supposed to be allies, but in practice, they barely cooperated. The Kuomintang bore the brunt of the conventional fighting against Japanese forces. The communists engaged in guerrilla warfare behind Japanese lines, expanding their influence in the countryside. Mao's strategy was clear: preserve communist strength, expand base areas, and prepare for the inevitable showdown with the Kuomintang after Japan was defeated. The communists implemented land reform in areas they controlled, winning the loyalty of millions of peasants. The Kuomintang, meanwhile, became increasingly corrupt and authoritarian. Inflation soared. Conscription was brutal and often fatal. Chiang's government was losing the confidence of the people. Japan surrendered in August 1945 after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was over, but China was not at peace. Both the communists and the Kuomintang rushed to accept the surrender of Japanese forces and seize their weapons. The United States, which had supported Chiang during the war, tried to broker a political settlement between the two sides. General George Marshall was sent to mediate. The effort failed. Neither side trusted the other. Neither side was willing to compromise. By 1946, full-scale civil war had resumed. The Chinese Civil War from 1946 to 1949 was the final test. On paper, the Kuomintang had every advantage: larger armies, control of the cities, international recognition, and American aid. But the communists had something more valuable: popular support in the countryside and superior morale. Chiang's forces were plagued by corruption, poor leadership, and desertions. Soldiers were often unpaid and unfed. The Kuomintang's economic policies caused hyperinflation that destroyed the savings of the middle class. In contrast, the communist forces were disciplined, motivated by ideology, and supported by peasants who had benefited from land reform. The turning point came in the three major campaigns of 1948 and 1949, the Liaoshen, Huaihai, and Pingjin campaigns. In these massive engagements, the People's Liberation Army, as the Red Army was now called, defeated Kuomintang forces decisively. Entire armies defected or were annihilated. Chiang's best troops were lost. By the end of 1948, the Communists controlled Manchuria and much of northern China. In January 1949, Beijing fell without a fight. In April, Communist forces crossed the Yangtze River, the symbolic boundary of southern China. Nanjing, the Kuomintang capital, fell. Shanghai fell in May. Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan with the remnants of his government, taking China's gold reserves and claiming to be the legitimate government of all China. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood before a crowd of hundreds of thousands in Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. He said, "The Chinese people have stood up." It was a statement of triumph and defiance, the end of a century of humiliation, foreign invasion, and civil war. China was united under a single government for the first time in decades. But it was a communist government, aligned with the Soviet Union, committed to class struggle and socialist transformation. The victory of the communists was not inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions, failures, and structural conditions. The Qing Dynasty's inability to reform made revolution necessary. The warlords' chaos made centralized power attractive. The Kuomintang's corruption and brutality during the war alienated the population. The Japanese invasion devastated the Kuomintang's base and gave the communists room to grow. Mao's strategic flexibility, his willingness to base the revolution on the peasantry rather than the workers, allowed the party to survive and expand. Land reform won the loyalty of millions. The promise of equality, justice, and national strength resonated in a country that had been humiliated and exploited for a century. But the story did not end in 1949. The establishment of the People's Republic was only the beginning of a radical and often catastrophic experiment. Mao launched land reform on a national scale, followed by collectivization. Landlords were subjected to public trials and executions. Private property was abolished. In 1958, Mao initiated the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to rapidly industrialize China through mass mobilization. It was a disaster. Unrealistic production targets, the abandonment of rational planning, and the suppression of dissent led to the Great Chinese Famine, in which tens of millions of people starved to death between 1959 and 1961. Then came the Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966, a decade of political upheaval in which Mao mobilized young Red Guards to attack capitalist roaders within the party, destroy traditional culture, and purge intellectuals. Schools closed. Millions were persecuted, tortured, or killed. The economy stagnated. China turned inward, isolated and traumatized. It was only after Mao's death in 1976 and the rise of Deng Xiaoping that China began to reform, opening its economy while maintaining Communist Party control. The result was the hybrid system China has today: capitalist in economics, authoritarian in politics. The party that came to power promising equality and revolution now presides over one of the most unequal societies on earth, with billionaires and a surveillance state. The irony is profound. China became communist because a century of failure, humiliation, and violence created a vacuum that only the most radical, disciplined, and ruthless movement could fill. The Qing could not reform, the Republic could not unify, the Kuomintang could not govern. The communists offered what no one else could: a vision of total transformation, a promise that China would never again be weak, divided, or humiliated. That promise came at an unimaginable cost. The question that haunts China today is whether the cost was worth it and whether the party that built its legitimacy on revolution can survive in a world where revolution is the last thing it wants.